This is DibTech Talk, a show where we make sense of all things cybersecurity for the defense industrial base. I bring fresh showers for the thirsting flowers from the seas and the streams. I bear light shade for the leaves when laid in their noonday dreams. Clouds, when described by Percy Shelley, are beautiful. Clouds, when described by your IT team, can be confusing, complex, and nebulous. More and more companies are moving to the cloud, which is why it is so important that business owners understand the basics of the cloud and what using a cloud means for their security and their compliance requirements. Join me as I break through the fog and demystify cloud computing for the average user.
My name is Chris Hughes. I have about 15 years of IT/cybersecurity experience. I started off active duty in the U.S. Air Force. From there, left to defense contracting, where I worked with various agencies like DISA. Um, Left contracting and went back to civil service, where I worked with the Navy, SPAY War, or NAV War as they're called, Atlantic, where I got some early experience for some of their cloud service activities with the Defense Health Agency, some of their early cloud pilot activities, and standing up cloud brokerages, both within the Navy and Defense Health Agency. And then from there, I went to another government agency known as GSA, or the General Services Administration. And while there, I worked with TTS or 18F on some of their cloud-based systems as their security manager, and also served on the FedRAMP Joint Authorization Board, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, while I was at GSA. Currently, I work for a consulting company called Otimo, which does work in the public and private sectors. Our most notable public sector client is Platform One, which is the DoD DevSecOps initiative that gets a lot of attention coming out of the Air Force. In addition to that, I teach at two different universities, University of Maryland Global Campus and Capital Technology University, both in their graduate cybersecurity programs, where I teach everything from cybersecurity fundamentals all the way through cloud and forensics and a lot of different topics. And I also participate in various industry working groups, such as the Cloud Security Alliance, in particular DC chapter, and help with some white papers around cloud and cloud security.
Wow. So you are uniquely positioned to talk about all of the cool tech stuff, but also you can help us break it down Barney style so that we don't lose anybody here. So back to the basics. What is a cloud? Because I think still people sometimes talk about it and don't really understand what it is. So can you break it down at its like most fundamental level? What is a cloud?
Yeah, the easiest way to think about it is kind of on-demand access to various resources such as compute, networking, and storage. And you have various operating models, whether it's a public cloud that's available to everyone, every customer, a private cloud that's only available to a certain select group of users and communities, and then a community cloud that's maybe a group of organizations that are using the cloud in that sense. It gives an organization access via the internet, of course, to compute, networking, storage, the typical things that you would use to build and manage applications.
Okay, so I'm from Huntsville, Alabama, and Huntsville has I think they have a Facebook server farm. So the cloud really is a bunch of computers that exist somewhere, right? Like they're in a physical form at some place, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Typically, they're in a data center. You would have had this in your old, like, say you had a data center for your old organization where you guys housed all the physical hardware, equipment, et cetera, and you had to, have capital expenditures to buy these things and manage their life cycle and upgrade them as they age and become antiquated. Now, instead of doing that, you have kind of a metered service model where you're just consuming these services from the cloud service provider. You don't have to worry about the underlying hardware and management, heating, cooling, physical security, things of that nature. Instead, you just consume it as a service now.
So do you, in your experience, are people being businesses, companies, government, are people transitioning to the cloud from on-premises servers and on-prem storage devices?
Absolutely, especially with regard to the government in particular. Obviously, they have a massive data center footprint. So they're migrating to the cloud. Existing applications, existing operations, things of that nature. But with that said, there's plenty of what's called greenfield development and greenfield applications. These are things that are basically starting off in the cloud to begin with, rather than having any kind of legacy on-premise footprint. And you see this a lot among startups in particular. They don't have that legacy data center footprint. They just go right to the cloud and start building and operating directly there.
So is this cheaper than having stuff on-prem?
It truly depends. And a lot of the conversation is always, initially it was framed around the cost perspective, right? I don't have to physically own these things. I don't have to heat, cooling, physical security, right? But it depends what you want to do with these things as well. It can become incredibly expensive if you're scaling up. You have a lot of systems running that aren't being used. You want to make sure you have cost optimization in place as well, because it's like any other utility. If I continue to use it and expend it, it's going to cost something, right? There's still a cost associated with it. You can save money, of course, if it's done right, but it can cost you more as well. You truly need to do it the right way.
So, you said something about physical security of these things, right? Like if you have them on-prem, you're responsible for securing them. So, how secure are cloud networks? I had a classmate of mine at Cornell just a couple of weeks ago, and I was recommending that they transition to the cloud for their own personal storage device. Don't put it on your laptop. Put it in the cloud. And they were like, "But is that secure?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, of course." Can you explain why it's secure and how it's secure?
So I actually want to caveat that by saying it depends. It depends
Okay.
how you configure it. It depends. So there's a lot of factors at play there, right? They definitely have, and we'll touch on this stuff in the conversation. But there's, these service offerings are essentially assessed by third parties, for various compliance frameworks, FedRAMP, DoD, Security Requirements Guide, HIPAA, and on, high trust, right? So they're assessed in that regard. But it also depends, how do you configure these services? Are you configuring them in a secure way to where your data is encrypted and that you have control of the encryption keys, things of that nature, or is it publicly exposed and open to anyone? So it really depends how it's architected. I mean, we've seen over the last few years, of course, many high-profile data breaches in the cloud environment due to poorly configured cloud services and data storage and things of that nature. This is something I always stress is as part of a cloud migration journey and plan. Don't always just look at the tech and things like that, but look at your workforce. Do you have the people in place to manage these cloud services appropriately and configure them securely so you can safeguard your data, your customers' data, because you're ultimately still owning that data and still owning that responsibility for that data.
So back to the configuration. So personal use versus company use. So for personal use, am I smart enough to configure my own cloud to make sure that it's secure? Like, what are some of the configurations that I should be verifying in my Google Drive to make sure that it's secure?
Yeah, so I mean, these are if you're using something like Google Drive, like what is called software as a service, right? You're not worried about the infrastructure and the operating system and things of that nature. You just want a service you can use. It's very easy to use, like Google Drive. You want to look at some of the fundamentals, like ensuring that access control. Who can access your Google Drive? Do you have multi-factor authentication in place so that if someone else tries to access it with your username and password, for example, it would also authenticate to your, say
Can you
your phone, right?
Before we keep going, can you describe briefly what multi-factor authentication is? It gets thrown around a lot. It's required in NIST 80171. It's required in the CMMC. But this is one of the fundamental things that people talk about and may not know exactly what it means. Can you describe the different types of MFA or multi-factor authentication?
Yeah, so multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, as it's sometimes called, is essentially another layer of authentication on top of your traditional username and password. Now, say you just have a username and password, and your password is admin or something very easy to guess. That puts you in a very dangerous situation if someone was to pair the username with a guessable password and just basically get access to all your information, your anything you have stored, essentially, right? Adding that multi-factor authentication adds an additional layer of authentication on top of that. And there's various different methods, such as hard tokens. Maybe you have some kind of physical device that generates a key, like a key fob, as they call it, that generates basically an ID on a different interval, and you grab that as part of your authentication process. Or you have a soft token, like something on your phone. One popular one is Google Authenticator.
Mhm.
Maybe I go to log into my Google Drive and I put my username and password in, but in addition to that, it also tells me to go to Google Authenticator on my phone and enter a PIN that's there. That adds an additional level of security, basically defense in depth around your authentication process.
Okay, thank you. That was great. Okay, where were we? We were talking about the settings for your cloud. So making sure that access control is limited to the people that you want to provide access to, and definitely setting up multi-factor authentication. So what else should the average home user be considering with regard to their own personal cloud storage?
I would definitely take a look at the service provider that you're using. Taking a look into them and seeing are they reputable? Where are they based? What compliance frameworks are they meeting? Because it's kind of easy with cloud now for anyone to start a business and just start offering a service to a customer. Learn about the organization. Are they reputable? Are a lot of people using them? How do they handle your privacy and your data? What kind of track record do they have around that? And then of course, there's those settings we talked about around, encryption and authentication and things like that yourself. But ultimately, you always have to make that. It's ultimately a risk decision. Am I comfortable putting this kind of data? Maybe it's personal pictures, family pictures, PII, PHI, personal health information, personal identifiable information. Am I comfortable putting that into an external environment? That's something you need to make a determination on.
Okay, so this is going to be kind of like a 300 level class, like not freshman level class here. So sorry to jump so abruptly, but what is the difference? So speaking about encryption, and this kind of segues into the professional use for cloud storage, especially defense contractors and any federal contractor that's housing CUI, controlled unclassified information. A lot of platforms will talk about their encryption standards, and some platforms use AES and some use FIPS. And if you're a defense contractor and you handle CUI, well, if you're any defense or any federal contractor and you handle CUI, you should be using FIPS validated encryption. Can you talk about the differences in those two standards and because that information is located in cloud storage provider security information generally, but what are those two different standards? And yeah, can you talk about what those two different things are?
Yeah, so AES is not. I don't necessarily think of it as a standard. It's an encryption algorithm, right?
Right.
Where FIPS, Federal Information Processing Standard, typically called 140 TAC 2 or 140 TAC 3, is basically a federal standard around integrity and encryption and things of that nature. And you have algorithms that are included and approved under FIPS, for example. So when they talk about FIPS, they're saying that our encryption standards, our encryption use of encryption complies with FIPS, for example. So that's
Okay.
something you want to take a look at as part of your encryption and your data storage with a cloud service provider.
And what are some other considerations that businesses who are also federal contractors and they're looking at cloud storage options? What are some things that they should be thinking about in addition to the FIPS encryption? What else should they be looking at, or how should they be vetting these cloud providers?
So one of the big ones in terms of what you should look at is keys, right? So it's not only like is the algorithm compliant with FIPS, for example. That's kind of an easy one to determine and look through the cloud service provider and determine if that's the case or not. But also keys. Are you comfortable letting the cloud service provider maintain, manage, rotate your keys, or is that something you want to maintain full ownership of as the customer consuming this service? So that's one of the major things I always have folks look at is like, do you want to maintain ownership of the encryption keys, or do you want to allow the cloud service provider to do that? And not only that, some people take it even a step further, and they want to encrypt the data before it even goes into the cloud environment, right? They don't want the keys, none of that stuff occurring or happening in the cloud environment. They want to do it themselves and then put the encrypted data there. But I will say that adds obviously, complexity and overhead and management. So it's definitely a consideration.
So when you say keys, what exactly do you mean? Because keys shows up a few times in NIST 800-171. These encryption keys, are these physical keys like tokens? Are they passwords? Are they what are keys exactly?
So no, it's not physical, not a physical key. It's basically what's going to be used to encrypt your data in that environment. Whether it's AES or other encryption algorithms, right? It's going to generate something that's used to make that plain text data, which is the data that you can understand and easily see and read, and convert it into ciphertext, right? Something that's not readable. You can't just look at it and understand it. And then the key is going to be used to both encrypt the data and then ultimately decrypt the data to make it readable again as well.
And so if a cloud provider manages those keys for you, what is your role in, like, if you're trying to make the decision, should I let them manage it or should I manage it? What's the lift on my end if I'm managing it, and what's the lift on my end if they're managing it? How does that look? What does that look like?
So if I let them manage it on their end, there's not a huge lift on my end, and I'm kind of entrusting them to do this. And in many cases, many of them have shown, through third-party attestation, things like that, and widespread industry adoption, that they can do that, sufficiently. But depending on the sensitivity of the data, if I have nuclear data, for example, maybe I'm not comfortable giving that to the cloud service provider, and then I need to maintain ownership of the keys. So that involves things such as rotating the keys on a certain interval, right? That may be dictated via compliance or just organizational policy. Also controlling access to the keys. Who can use the keys? And then there's segregation of duties as well. Maybe one group can go in and manage the keys, rotate them, things like that, and another group can actually use the keys. I'm sorry, to encrypt data, decrypt data, right? So segregating duties is another example of a consideration around encryption in the cloud.
So can the cloud provider view your information that's being stored in their cloud?
It really comes down to if if they have ownership of the keys or if you have ownership of the keys. But I will say the large cloud service providers, AWS, Azure, and GCP, they have very extensive internal processes around that, and so that they ensure that that does not occur. Whether it's segregation of duties or how they're logically storing and controlling access to those keys to ensure that they're not unencrypted and available to personnel, for example, to take and go compromise your data.
Yeah, no, that's good. Good news. So back to third party verification and attestation to standards. You talked earlier about FedRAMP, and FedRAMP gets thrown around a lot as well. There's a lot of question about, at least in the CMMC ecosystem, if the assessors need to be using FedRAMP authorized cloud providers. What is FedRAMP exactly? What is that process, and how does it relate to cloud?
So even though I was on the FedRAMP Joint Authorization Board, I can't throw out the full length name offhand.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what it means
Basically,
either.
so basically, FedRAMP is the process that's been put in place to vet what's called cloud service offerings (CSOs) from cloud service providers (CSPs). So you think of the big ones, easily just thrown out AWS, Azure, and GCP, right? Any cloud service that's being consumed by a federal agency or a DoD entity should have gone through the FedRAMP process. And what that means is it takes the same 853 NIST controls that you're comfortable with and you've likely used if you've worked in the DoD, and it evaluates these cloud service providers and their associated cloud service offerings to see if they comply with the applicable security controls from 853. And FedRAMP has different baselines like low, moderate, and high, for example, depending on the data sensitivity and things of that nature. So any federal agency, DoD entity that's looking to use cloud services should be using services that have been approved by FedRAMP. Whether that's the reality, I can tell you that's not necessarily always the case because it takes a lot of time, money, investment for these services to go through that process. And mission owners sometimes are just very anxious to use a service, or they don't understand the policies and requirements. And then there's another level to it too, which we can touch on in a moment if you want, which is DoD Security Requirements Guide. So FedRAMP is for commercial federal agencies, but if I'm on the DoD, there's also what's called the DoD Security Requirements Guide, which is an additional step and additional control, subset of controls that the service offerings get evaluated against.
So, to be FedRAMP, is the correct term FedRAMP authorized? Like
Mhm.
if they've gone through the whole thing, it's FedRAMP authorized. So, I've heard that to be FedRAMP authorized, they have to have a contract, a federal contract in order to get that. So there are cloud providers that are not federal contractors that have no avenue towards being FedRAMP authorized. Is that true?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. So basically, what will happen is to go through the FedRAMP process, you need a sponsor, and
Mm.
typically you need an agency to come by and say, "Hey, we are sponsoring this cloud service provider or this cloud service offering, and we want to help them go through the FedRAMP process because we want their service and we want to consume what they're offering." So having that sponsor is a big piece of the puzzle, and the reason for that is if I'm FedRAMP and I have limited staff, limited resources, limited time, I can't just assess everyone. I need to have a demand that justifies my time and energy investment in this CSP, basically.
So, but there are cloud providers that are FedRAMP ready, I think is what the term they used.
Yeah, yeah, and they'll use that, saying that they've kind of done a self-evaluation, or even a third party may have taken a look at them and assumed, based on the evaluation that they comply with the necessary controls. They just haven't been able to go through the formalized FedRAMP process yet.
Okay. And so for people out there looking for cloud providers, it's not a total deal breaker that they're not FedRAMP authorized. But if they were, as long as they're not a federal agency, for companies looking to find a cloud provider, FedRAMP ready would be a good something to consider, but not necessarily a deal breaker. So
That's right. I was
yeah.
just going to add on that, if I may.
Mhm.
So it does give you some level of comfort, but remember, this is them making an assertion that they're FedRAMP ready. They haven't formally gone through the process. And I also want to throw out there too, we're seeing FedRAMP grow in popularity. There's now what's called StateRAMP coming about. So not only for the federal government, but now at the state level, we're going to see assessment and authorization of cloud services to be consumed by the states as well, state governments. And the good thing, of course, is there's reciprocity between the two. So if someone's gone through the FedRAMP process, they don't need to get assessed again at the state level. You kind of have a level of assurance that they've already been through the process.
Okay. And earlier you talked about the impact levels, low, medium, and high. Can you talk about what those impact levels are with relation to the types of controls that they've implemented?
Yeah, so basically, like I mentioned, the NIST 853 controls that we're all, anyone that's been around DoD is familiar with the NIST controls that you have to meet, right, for systems based on impact level and things like that, and system categorization. FedRAMP is basically a similar approach where you have, low, moderate, high, and each of those different levels is going to have a different subset of the NIST 853 control baselines, with high obviously being the most robust, the most number of controls, and it's no surprise that you have the fewest number of cloud service providers authorized at the high level because it's so rigorous, time consuming, expensive, and it's just a very mature set of controls that many CSPs can't meet basically.
Yeah, so I just want to bring up because this is a great part of the show to bring this up, but CUI. So when contractors handle CUI, they have to handle it at impact level moderate. So if somebody is looking at a cloud provider that says they are FedRAMP authorized, but for impact level low, it does not meet the requirement to handle CUI. Yes, there are certain types of CUI that need to be handled at the high impact level, but those types are few and far between and very explicitly required. But the CUI basic must be FedRAMP impact level moderate,
That's
right?
right. And so FedRAMP impact level moderate is equivalent also, just to add on to that, FedRAMP moderate, basically, the baseline is equivalent with what's called the DoD Security Requirements Guide impact level 2. So that's something, if you're in DoD or DoD vendor looking at the DoD SRG and services that are authorized at the various impact levels of DoD SRG, impact level 2 would be equivalent to FedRAMP moderate.
Okay, no, that's good to know. I actually came across a DISA briefing on the internet the other day and saw these different levels and hadn't really seen much of that because I don't do this, never did this on the DoD side.
Mhm.
So I want to pick your brain a little bit about Jedi. It's been in the news lately. Well, it's been in the news, I think, ever since it was announced because it's, this giant, what, $10 billion, $20 billion contract over 10 years. Can you break down what that is? We don't have to break down the acronym, but it kind of explain what the concept was, why DoD was trying to procure this ginormous cloud, and what it might have been used for if it wasn't tied down in the courts.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, Jedi's kind of been mired in controversy since its inception. It was initially projected to be up to 10 years, $10 billion, if I recall, and it was basically to kind of create an enterprise-wide DoD cloud platform, essentially, right, for the DoD. And the award, and the reason it got so controversial is it was initially designed and awarded basically for a single vendor, a single cloud service provider, whether it's GCP, Azure, Oracle, IBM, AWS, etc. And obviously that means everyone else is excluded, and everyone else is very upset about that. So that led to a lot of protest activities. And with that said, it also contrasts with industry best practices and the direction we're seeing the industry go in terms of multi-cloud deployment and adoption. It kind of set the standard of one, major cloud provider having full reign of things for the most part. So that was kind of the intent of it, and that's why it led to a lot of controversy. And with that said, we're now seeing it's been held up in court, several years at this point. They've spent, I think, over $5 million just administering it and handling that portion of things. All that time, mission owners and warfighters basically are waiting for this enterprise-wide cloud capability that has not materialized. And I also want to throw out there, the intelligence community just actually recently awarded a major cloud acquisition that was a multi-cloud award. Ironically enough, the current acting DoD CIO came from the intelligence community, where, like I said, it's a multi-cloud award. So I suspect we'll likely see something similar now.
So you said something about like DoD does need a standardized, almost like architecture or plan for the cloud. Does DoD have a cloud architecture strategy? Do you think that do you know if they're working on, should they be working on, and should there be a federal strategy for cloud? Because now, well, hopefully the NDAA of 2021 mandates that there be a national cyber director, kind of like we have a centralized intelligence community. Now we're looking at the same thing for cyber. Do you see the federal government adopting a cloud strategy, or are they waiting on DoD to have a cloud strategy, or what is your insight into cloud strategy for DoD?
Yeah, so I know that that already exists both at the federal level and DoD level. It's already been articulated, not necessarily an architecture as you said, but definitely a strategy. You know, we initially saw, I think it was back in 2011, the cloud first policy, right? And then here we are, 2021, 10 years later, and now we've recently seen a year or two ago, I think it was called cloud smart strategy, right? So instead of cloud first, you know, cloud smart, getting a bit more mature with adoption, thinking about things as we go through this process and not just jumping right in to the cloud. So being a bit smarter with that. So there are strategies already articulated. And it's already been mentioned from various leaders like Mrs. Kent, who was former CIO within the federal government, right? Also the Jake leadership, as I mentioned, JIC leadership, DoD former DoD CIO Dana Deasy have all articulated the criticality and the importance of cloud. With that said, I just want to throw out too, we saw COVID and 2020 was a crazy year, especially for federal government and the way they operate. And what do you think helped sustain the resiliency and operations of the federal government during 2020? Cloud services.
Absolutely. So I kind of want to go circle back to something we talked about earlier, which is cloud security, but inheriting cloud security, the end users, whether it be a defense contractor or personal use, but inherited cloud security, but relating to compliance. Where else was I? I was going. I should have taken a better note. Hold on. What was I thinking?
How about
Um,
inheriting controls and things of that
Well,
nature?
so inheriting controls, but also having this large enterprise cloud. So I'm a cybersecurity consultant. I work every day face to face with defense contractors that are trying to implement NIST 800-171. They're trying to figure out Cmmc, and it's really expensive because they don't have MFA.
Yeah.
They have cloud. They maybe use Dropbox, but Dropbox uses AES and does not use FIP. So now they have to transition to something else, and they're looking at higher licenses for Microsoft because So would it ever be feasible in your opinion, realizing that the end users inherit the controls, the security controls from the cloud? What if DoD were to extend cloud instances, right, or cloud storage, or in some way allow the defense industrial base to buy in, or have some sort of like group cloud that everyone can buy into that's more affordable? Is that something that is talked about or thought about or feasible?
So I think we should definitely try to unpack this topic. It's a very, very important and interesting topic. So I will say, part of cloud is what's called the shared responsibility model. If I'm using cloud, there's different constructs such as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And as you kind of go through those constructs, you're responsible for less, and the cloud service provider is responsible for more. And anyone that's done compliance and NIST work, RMF work within the DoD for some time, as you mentioned, no, it's a heavy lift. It's very expensive and time consuming. This is what we see with like initiatives such as Cloud One, for example. If I have an authorized infrastructure as a service environment where a lot of mission owners can come, they can work in this authorized environment. It's already accredited. Same thing with DoD's DevSecOps initiative called Platform One. If I can come there and just focus on my core competencies, which is as a DIB vendor is just kind of providing innovation or whatever I do for DoD, that helps expedite my authorization process, right? I don't need to worry about the underlying hardware. I don't need to worry about maybe even operating systems, things of that nature. It expedites that process and lets me focus on what my core competencies are. And we've actually seen comments, if I'm not mistaken, from Ellen Lord when she was in the position she was in about the concept of potentially a shared enclave, right, in the cloud where DIB vendors can come and operate. I think it's definitely feasible, but there's a lot of considerations around that. How are you going to segregate organizations, the data, and then also, are people going to be comfortable putting proprietary, competitive advantage information into this multi-tenant environment with all their potentially competitors operating in the same space as them? How are you going to segregate that out and kind of accredit it and things like that? How are you going to break it out?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. But these people, these contractors, companies that are, facing potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of upgrades, um, just to survive in the DoD supply chain, I guess you kind of like this is a trade-off, right? Like I get to keep my revenue, potentially risk sharing
Yeah.
my intellectual property with someone else. Um, how, let's see,
Do
trying to
you
think.
do you mind
Mhm.
if I say something?
Yeah,
So
no, go ahead.
So on that note, talking about CMMC and 800-171 around DIB vendors, right? It's div vendors, as you know, there's thousands of vendors in this space, many of which are SMBs that don't have internal IT and cybersecurity expertise. And now you're seeing from the big cloud service providers such as Azure and AWS, you're now seeing a push towards delivering CMMC, tailored offerings for
Mhm.
those SMBs operating in the div space. That they can come use these cloud services, these cloud environments, whether it's a reference architecture to get them up and running, meeting some of the CMMC controls and practices and whatnot, and kind of speed up that process. And then that gets even more interesting when you hear recent comments, around potential reciprocity from FedRAMP to CMMC. So if I'm a cloud service provider, I already have all these FedRAMP authorized services, can I now just turn around and offer these services, to div vendors via, a CMMC tailored offering, since I've already been through the authorization process of FedRAMP?
But doesn't FedRAMP allow for POAMs, for plan of action and milestones, acknowledging that you have gaps? So yes, DoD is saying reciprocity with FedRAMP. Do you see this allowance for POAMs gumming that up potentially?
I do, and this is something just CMMC in general. Anyone that's done this type of work, risk management work, cybersecurity work, you know that there's very rarely, if ever, a situation where you have 100% compliance. All controls are met, everything is great. That's very unrealistic and not often the reality. Whether it's due to resources, funding, staffing, schedule. There's typically controls that can't be met, and you have mitigating controls in place, or you have items, as you said, on a POAM, a plan of action and milestone, to show how we're going to meet these at X date in the future. If I have a FedRAMP service offering from a cloud service provider, you can be sure that they likely have POAMs for some of those controls. So how can I have reciprocity between two frameworks when one allows some controls to be unmet and POAM for a future date, and the other is you're 100% compliant or you're not? That is a problem to me, and I think that's why you need to have practitioners involved in the policy creation process.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that if FedRAMP's okay for the federal government, why are POAMs not okay for the civilian sector, for the contractors that are supporting DoD?
And that's
So
that's actually a point I've brought up too, right? So, and I've been in DoD space some time, many years. You as well, in the federal government space. If federal government and DoD systems are never 100% compliant, how can we ask that of the DIB community, which often has less cyber and IT expertise than the DoD and federal government themselves?
for sure. So do you think this 100% compliance mandate for CMMC stands? Again, this is a Chris opinion. Just if you had a crystal ball, do you think that this remains, or do you see some sort of potentially give and take on that requirement?
I personally think and hope we see some give and take on that. I've seen a lot of people that share, my background and experience raise similar concerns. I think what it does is it presents a unique challenge. On one hand, you either exclude a large number of organizations who offer innovative, competitive solutions to the DoD because they can't be 100% compliant, or you reach a slippery slope where assessors and organizations themselves are kind of trying to blur the lines to get compliant just to do work with the federal government.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the you were talking about these providers for small medium-sized businesses that are helping them to leverage the cloud, or they're offering vendors are now offering CMMC and NEST 800 171 compliant offerings. Do you have any idea on the cost to small business? Is the cost by endpoint? Is the cost by the amount of data? How is that price kind of structured, and how are they making it affordable to these small and medium sized businesses? Because a lot of people say it's affordable, but then when you start tacking on each service that each endpoint needs, and if it's priced by endpoint, then it gets really pricey, and then you might as well just do something else. So do you have any insight into how these are being priced to make it truly affordable and attainable?
So I don't have insight into like the CMMC pricing models of the large CSPs, but I will say typically what I've seen from cloud services, it depends on the service. Some are endpoint specific, some are data, bulk data, total specific, for example, things like that. But I will say, they're doing their best effort, from my knowledge, to try to make them affordable. And you also have to ask yourself, if I was to try to say I have no cybersecurity expertise at my organization, to recreate what you're going to use, what would it cost you to have the staff, whether it's external staff come in and help, or internal staff you have to hire and maintain? And not only that, but the services, the infrastructure, et cetera. What would it cost me to do that versus just consuming it as a service?
That's a really, really, really good point, because you need at least a few full-time IT staff to handle all the stuff that the cloud is now going to do for you. Is there anything else about cloud that we haven't talked about that you think is super relevant for the defense industrial base, for people in general when trying to understand the cloud?
So actually, one of the things I do want to stress, if you're not already using cloud services, or even if you are, is just being very understanding of the shared responsibility model. So yes, I'm using cloud services. Yes, they may be compliant with XYZ framework, but there's still a shared responsibility. And me as a consumer, what is my responsibility? Because even discussing like FedRAMP, for example, there's some controls that are fully met and handled by the cloud service provider. There's some controls that are shared between me and the cloud service provider, and then there's still some controls that are ultimately my responsibility. So you need to maintain that awareness and understanding of that, because a lot of people think, oh, I'm using the cloud, I'm good to go. It's compliant. That's not the case. It's still your data, it's still your reputation. Regulatory impacts, a lot of concerns you need to be aware of.
Yeah, and that's a really good point for the CMMC. You have to, in the CMMC, you have to have a policy which addresses all of the domains, which address all of the controls in the domain. So even if you're saying that you use the cloud, so therefore, these controls are covered, you still have to explain, to your point, the shared responsibility. Like it is our responsibility to establish access control, and they ensure that it's enforced. So to that point, how do you think CMMC is, and again, this is crystal ball, Chris, because we don't have any idea any of these answers today. But how does a CMMC assessor handle those shared responsibilities, right? If they walk into a company and I'm like, hey, I use AWS, they handle all of these controls. Surely AWS doesn't have enough capacity for all of those thousands of assessors to ping them every day to validate those controls. So how do you see this playing out?
So there's actually a couple of things there. What happens when you get a cloud service offering authorized via FedRAMP or DoD SRG, as we talked about? Those cloud service providers will make available their security packages, which document the security controls, how they're being met, and then also, as we discussed, which controls are not met and why they're not met and how they're mitigating them and when they plan to meet them, those kind of things. So you can request access via the FedRAMP marketplace and PMO to a FedRAMP package, for example, or through DISA to a DoD SRG package for a cloud service provider.
But I hopefully, like once a company goes through an assessment with, AWS configured a certain way, that assessor will be like, yep. So the next time I come across this, I'll know that it's good to go. So um, maybe it'll be a repository of cloud providers and services and third parties that have, somehow been validated or, like I don't know how that works, but it seems
Why?
like it's going to
Yeah,
be.
I think over time we'll definitely see that maturity, right? If I'm say I'm Coalfire, I'm a big assessment organization, and I'm doing this all the time. I'm seeing these cloud service providers all the time. You're going to build that internal proficiency among your staff and your knowledge base, for these various scenarios you see over and over and over again. So we'll definitely see that maturity come along. But I think the assessment organizations also need to make an investment in their resources, their folks, to make sure they understand the technologies.
And you have some good classes that you can teach these people on cloud, right?
Yeah, that's right. They can come to the universities I'm at, and there's, just a couple plugs. There's plenty of training providers such as Udemy.com, acloudguru.com, Pluralsight. There's so many. In my opinion, the learning is democratized now. It's available. It's very affordable. You just got to go out and be willing to learn it.